A reading from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. The word that Isaiah, son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In days to come, the mountain of God's house shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised above the hills. Of all the nations shall stream to it. Many peoples shall come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of God, to the house of the God of Jacob, that God may teach us God's ways, and that we may walk in God's path. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, Torah, and the word of God from Jerusalem. God shall judge between the nations, and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of God." Good morning, friends. On this, or during this first week of Advent, and also this week in which we have World AIDS Day, and remember the more than 35 million people that have died of the AIDS pandemic, often because swords were pointed at them instead of helping hands. Advent is a time when we seek the light. The text that I will focus on primarily today is the text from Isaiah. But how do you preach about a text about peace in a time of war? War is again fashionable. Peace is on the defensive. Peace stands accused. We are here today to beat our swords into plowshares and to learn war no more. This extraordinary text from the prophet Isaiah in the Hebrew Bible from more than 2,700 years ago radically challenges us to use our destructive inclinations no longer against each other, but against war itself. We all have destructive forces in us that must be channeled against the tools of war and the mindset of making war, so that peace on earth can be truly realized. Now, if you doubt that you have any destructive forces in yourself, just be mindful the next time you have a meal, how your teeth are instruments of destruction, but they are instruments of destruction to produce nurture. They channel your destructiveness into something that is nourishing. This is the heart of Isaiah's vision of peace. Plowshares symbolize that we transform the inevitable aggression and destructiveness in each of us into something that can nurture us in the community rather than something we use to kill each other with. There is no life without destruction. Human peace depends on whether we are able to transform our destruction from cannibalizing each other in war to working together to nourish us all. But that requires a radical shift in vision. It requires, in fact, that we destroy in ourselves the old vision and mechanisms we learned to make war. Isaiah's vision requires us to psychologically understand the mentality that makes us think war is justified. And to beat that mentality, to beat those destructive forces into a different mentality that nurtures and creates peace for all. For this to happen, I submit to you this morning, politics as well as religion and theology, that is the reflection of religion, must learn from psychology. Beat swords into plowshares and learn war no more. Isn't that just starry-eyed gibberish? Unrealistic, even dangerous chatter? Shouldn't we instead follow President Obama's Nobel Peace Prize speech from 2009 and simply agree that, as he put it, quote, the instruments of war do have a role to play in preserving peace, unquote. In a Nobel Peace Prize speech, folks. With this Orwellian gaslighting mentality of war is peace, more than 33,000 children were killed or maimed in the US-led war against Afghanistan over a 20-year period. Children are killed again in the Ukraine war today. This is what war does. Every war. No war is good. And every war also tries to use this horror to inflict more horror. It uses the horror as propaganda to wage a moral war against the enemy that then is used to justify more war and mobilize the people to support the war. Again, we see this happening in the Ukraine war. Both sides make claims of war crimes and use them to justify retaliation and to prolong the war. Horrors are happening, but they're also used for moral war-making. In Isaiah's vision, war is the crime. It is war that needs to be destroyed. Beat swords into plowshares and learn war no more. But why do we wage war to make peace? Obama said he did so to protect his country. He says he has been deeply influenced by Reinhold Niebuhr's Christian realism. Yet this view of reality is skewed by the long-standing US hegemonic vision of unity in which God becomes simply a tool to bless a nation's group narcissism, often euphemistically called manifest destiny or spreading democracy and liberty across the globe. When one nation tries to create other nations in its own image, this idolatrous group narcissism is at play. I'm not here to single out President Obama. He's just giving voice to whatever a king or president or party chairperson in the world has always done, to go to war because of the pernicious, destructive sort of nationalism. In that process, political leaders have even appealed explicitly to Isaiah's vision of peace and turned it into its exact opposite. 1959, no less than the Soviet Union gave a bronze statue as a gift to the United Nations, in which a soldier beats a sword into a plowshare. That year, the escalating Cold War could have come to an end. Instead, 2 years later, the Berlin Wall was erected, cementing the divisions between East and West for nearly 3 decades. The reason? Out of fear, both sides thought to inhabit the place reserved in Isaiah's vision for the divine alone, above all nations. Superpower syndrome is just that. For only the divine does not use that place above our human mountains to oppress, but rather to pull all of us truly up to higher ground in our unique ways. To this day, the statue sits in the garden of the UN headquarters in New York City. In 1969, President Nixon, let's choose someone from another party, chose to take his oath for the presidency with the Bible open to Isaiah 2:4. Nearly 4 years later, over Christmas 1972, Nixon launched the most intense air offensive of the Vietnam War, Operation Linebacker, dropping roughly 20,000 tons of bombs over densely populated regions. We see again a taste of what this is like when we open the newspapers or our online news resources today with images of Russian missiles hitting Ukrainian cities, probably as we're speaking. A month later, after Nixon's bombing offensive, he had to admit defeat. Friends, something is terribly wrong about the way politicians interpret Isaiah's vision of peace. Nixon's inaugural speech gives us a clue. He wants his nation to have, quote, the title of peacemaker. This honor now beckons America. The chance to help lead the world at last out of the valley of turmoil and onto that high ground of peace that man has dreamt of since the dawn of civilization. Can you hear what is wrong? If you hear it, you're already destroying the mechanisms of learning more. What's wrong is, he claims the title of peacemaker that is reserved for God in Isaiah. The American Empire will lead the world to the high ground of peace. When human leaders play God, they always force their own narrow, culturally conditioned vision of peace onto others with devastating consequences. Thus, in a split second, the vision of peace guaranteed by the divine turns into the mission of empire. It's the Tower of Babel tragedy all over again. Forced agreement, hegemonic unity, never creates lasting peace or unity. In that Pax Americana or Pax Russica or Pax NATO, one part, namely one's own group, one's own nation, one's own military alliance, becomes the whole. We draw borders, chop up the one humanity, and then we make war on each other, as if we still lived in the Stone Age. Eric H. Erickson, the great US-American psychoanalyst, best known for his work on human development, had a term for this tendency of human groups: pseudo-speciation. We treat our group as if it was the entire human species. and then feel justified to dehumanize those belonging to another group or nation, so that then we can kill them off like vermin. This happens in all forms of prejudice, racism, heterosexism, you name it, misogyny. This kind of dehumanization is key to learning more. You can see that I'm getting riled up. We need to use our destructive forces in us, our anger, to speak truth to power. We don't need physical weapons. We have words. We don't need to tear other people down. We tear down the dynamics that kill people. This kind of dehumanization is key to learning more. And it must be unlearned for lasting peace to become a reality in humanity. Beat swords into plowshares and learn more no more. No, Isaiah is not a starry-eyed idealized. He was not only a prophet speaking for God to the king of Judah, Ahaz, he was also a high-ranking advisor to kings. He was a realist, a different sort of realist than Reinhold Niebuhr. Isaiah lived at a time when war was being waged. The dominant empire at the time, Assyria, had invaded much of the territory of the Middle East and turned the states into vassal states. We today would say that they had been annexed as semi-autonomous territories and were forced to pay tribute money to the Assyrian Empire. At the time, the territory known to us today as Israel and Palestine was made up of two kingdoms, Israel to the north and Judah to the south. Judah had Jerusalem in it. Isaiah lived in Judah. The kingdom of Judah soon found itself in a somewhat similar situation to that of Ukraine today, between a rock and a hard place. The king of Judah, Ahaz, faced military pressure from the king of Israel and the king of Damascus to join their alliance to rebel against the expanding Assyrian Empire to the east. Isaiah urged King Ahaz to resist joining the anti-Assyrian military alliance with Israel and Damascus. When the king, in fact, did refuse the alliance, the kings of Israel and Damascus invaded Judah. Ahaz appealed to the Assyrian king to come to his country's rescue. Assyria obliged, defeated the kingdom of Israel, and deported large portions of its population. In exchange for protection, Judah paid Assyria a substantial amount of tribute money, but was not attacked by Assyria. Scholars emphasize that Isaiah did oppose joining the military alliance against Assyria, not because he was pro-Assyria, not because he wanted to promote the imperial Pax Assyrica. Isaiah radically breaks with putting our trust into any human military leaders, whether that of Assyria or of anti-Assyrian alliances. And this was a journey for Isaiah, because he himself would often talk about God as a warrior. But Isaiah learned something in this situation, and we have to learn that from Isaiah. Isaiah's vision spells the end of any hegemonic rule that makes peace by having other nations submit. Similarly, today's opposition by some political scientists like John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, as well as Europe's most prominent peace activist alive, Eugen Drewermann, a theologian, against fueling and prolonging the war in Ukraine with supplies of heavy armament by NATO countries, does not aim to support a Pax Russica. It aims to stop the killing of people on all sides. Estimates are that over 80,000 Russian soldiers have already died. Maybe the same amount or less on the Ukrainian side. Soldiers are people too. Isaiah's vision, lived today, means that we do not put our faith, our trust in any military, in any imperially coerced peace, not a Pax Russica, nor a Pax Americana, nor a Pax Military. But beat swords into plowshares and learn more. What swords in our mind need to be beaten into swords so that we no longer make or learn war? In psychology, psychological as well as socio-political problems can be seen as the result of certain mechanisms in our mind. There are a number of psychological mechanisms involved in learning war. I submit here that these mechanisms need to be beaten into plowshares, need to be shifted in such a way that they can no longer be used to make war, and instead help create universal peace. They have to be turned into something that breaks ground for planting seeds which turn into something that nurtures us all. Only then will we learn war no more. So I will mention a few here. The first is called, this is actually a psychological mechanism, omnipotent control. The desire to have unfettered power and influence. The Cold War showed us how East and West wanted omnipotent control by vying for spheres of influence. The Ukraine war is another instance of a proxy war between US-led NATO and Russia for global influence and dominance. What could beating omnipotent control into plowshares look like? Instead of using this mechanism against each other, because we all have that mechanism. That's what psychology tells us. Nations could come together to try omnipotent control, for instance, on hunger. Just imagine the US would spend $800 billion not on the military, but on getting rid of hunger once and for all. Last year, the UN Food Program showed billionaire Elon Musk how roughly 7 billion could avert hunger for 42 million vulnerable people around the globe. Imagine that, what less than 1% of the US military budget could do. And then imagine what 100% of that military budget could do. To make friends, as Jesus used to talk about money. The second and perhaps foremost psychological mechanism that needs to be beaten into plowshares is the group psychological mechanism of identification. To follow the call of war and to pick up weapons, we, the people, need to identify with the leaders' ideals, telling us that war and self-sacrifice is the only choice. It is not to lead to rulers. Isaiah's vision of peace intentionally makes no mention of kings, neither human kings, nor does it call God a king. De-identify with the leaders. Peace is only possible if we transcend the imperial ambitions, be it in the human domain or in the spiritual, religious domain. For people to beat the mechanism of identification to plowshares, we could follow Jesus' example and love our enemy, because our enemy is just as scared as we. That would be beating that mechanism into plowshares. The third psychological mechanism is splitting into absolute good and absolute evil. And I only have two brief ones after that. The mentality of war is predicated on splitting. Splitting people into absolute good and absolute evil is required for warfare. Only if you can completely dehumanize the enemy can you kill them. Here again, news coverage is very important. We split people into our side and them. Jesus explicitly counters this mechanism of splitting in the Sermon on the Mount while talking about enemies. In Matthew 5 he says, "You heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous." Do you see how he turns the mechanism of splitting around? God is the source of overcoming splitting, rather than of metaphysicizing it, infinitizing it. We can be the mechanism of splitting into plowshares by directing it at the mentality of war itself. War is evil. Period. If that is what humanity resolved together and said we're all part of one humanity, then we would channel all our analytical skills, all our resources into preventing war, not learning war. The mechanism of projection is already applied on the others. We think that what's destructive in us is really what's destructive out there. And again, we can use empathy to understand, Jesus used the idea of, you think there is something in your brother's or sister's eye? Look for the speck in your eye. It's in our lens. The last mechanism we need to address is the mechanism of rationalization. In theology, just war theory is the primary rationalization strategy. And here, we have to use our reason not to justify war, but to unravel war. We have so many great ideas. Psychology, social psychology, has so many wonderful insights. We have to make use of those reasons for not making war and learning war. Beat swords into plowshares and learn war no more. I want to close with a few lines from the song Billy, Don't Be a Hero by Bo Donaldson and the Haywoods, because it gives us an example in the unnamed fiancé of how to use our aggression to stop the human psychosis of war. The fiancé implores him, and I would love to sing it, I'm not that great of a singer. Billy, don't be a hero. Don't be a fool with your life. But Billy learned war. He volunteers and gets killed. The song concludes, I heard his fiancée got a letter that told how Billy died that day. The letter said that he was a hero. She should be proud he died that way. I heard her. She threw the letter away. Walking in the light of God means that we do not need to walk in the dark fears of our own mind when it is afraid. Let that light enlighten us to beat our destructive mechanisms into mechanisms that destroy the learning of war and build the beloved community of peoples around the globe.